I'm happy to introduce Dr. Benison Tilaga Chrisdas, Associate Professor, St. John's College, Palangotai. Actually, he's the moderator of the day because of his busy schedule, and he's a coordinator of different clubs and things in his college. And as he was in a training too, he was a little busy, and he was late for the day. Now he has joined us. I welcome you, sir, on behalf of Lavendary Club.
Yeah, thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Please,
Hello, hello,
sir.
ladies and gentlemen. Good evening to each and every one of you here. I'll continue after Dr. Rajesh has finished.
Okay, I welcome you, sir, on behalf of Lavendary Club. I
Thank you.
thank you on this busy day. You're here on time.
Welcome.
The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I could see a good number of scholars, research scholars, and lovers of research, I should say, with us this evening. Hearty welcome to each and every one of you. A word of special appreciation to the Lavender Club and the associated friends. This evening, we have been listening to Dr. Saravanan, and he was throwing light on the various parts of research, how to publish a paper, why we should write a paper, that too a research article, and how a research article could be made it could be produced with a good standard, and where to be published, how to select a journal. All these things he was talking about to us this evening. Here we have another special guest. She is Dr. Sarah M. Hart. Welcome, Dr. Sarah. Yeah, hearty welcome, hearty welcome. Right. I have great pleasure. It's my privilege, I should say, because she has done a lot in the name of research, who has studied the most, if I'm correct, the most untaught area. People don't think about this most of the time. They don't turn their eyes towards this. People, every time they think about some books, a few literary pieces in the name of scientific studies, they do a lot of research, and finally they publish their articles or their thesis. But here is a lady who has concentrated more on the practicalities of living. She has studied the students who have been significantly disabled. I would like to introduce her. She is Dr. Sarah M. Hart. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Education at the University of Hartford, Connecticut in the United States. She has completed her PhD in education at the University of Auckland, New Zealand. Her research and former teaching in both countries focus on post-school transitions. We are actually living in the world of transition. In a few years' time, so many things have happened in our life, right in front of us, around us. People with us have found a lot of transitions. Dr. Sarah has engaged a capability theory of social justice. Look at the phrase, social justice. We are living in a world where social justice is denied. And here she has done an inclusive qualitative research paradigm to examine the perspectives of young adults with significant disability. The perspectives of young adults with significant disability. Her work has been presented and published internationally in journals of special education, education, and methodology. She is the 2018 recipient of the Council of Exceptional Children's Division of Research Award. What a great privilege for each and every one of us. We are going to listen to her now. She currently serves on the University of Hartford's Institutional Review Board and is an editorial board member, excuse me, is an editorial board member for the journal Policy Futures in Education. Really, madam, we are happy, we are blessed, and really it is going to be a privileged one. We are very eagerly waiting for you. Ma'am, I don't want to stand between you and the other scholars. with us this evening. Here from India, this is evening. So we are very eagerly waiting for your presentation. Come on, it's your time, Dr. Sarah M. Hart. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. What a wonderful introduction. I appreciate
Thank
it
you
very
very
much.
much. Thanks a lot.
I'm going to share my screen. I've
Yes,
made a
please.
bit of a presentation for you. There we go. Would you mind just telling me if you can see it
Yeah,
okay?
it's okay. We can see your presentation. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, again, thank you so much for that warm welcome. I really appreciate it. Sarah Hart's my name, Assistant Professor of Special Education. I'm over in the United States at the moment. We're having a beautiful autumn day. I'm looking out my window. I could also see Dr. Jagaya is also in the Hartford, Connecticut area, and I saw the sun pouring in from her window as well. I'm so thrilled to be joining you today talking about research article writing and publication in high impact journals. Is a really important topic, and I'm really very appreciative that you're interested in my perspectives that I'll be sharing with you today on publishing research with diverse and vulnerable participants. But before we get into the topic, I'll just give a little bit more of an introduction to myself. We've already had such a great introduction. I'm a former special education teacher. I was trained here in the United States where I was born, but the majority of my teaching practice was done in New Zealand. And I've put an upside down map of the world for you. And New Zealand is right at the top and in the center, if you can see it there. I like to include that sort of perspective shift. So New Zealand was my home for over 15 years. It's also the place where I received my doctoral degree and did a lot of my early research. My area of focus, which was my focus for teaching, as well as now my area of research and scholarship, is on post-school transition, the experience of leaving school and beginning to adventure into your young adult life after school. And in particular, as was introduced, I'm interested in understanding that perspective from those young adults with significant disabilities. And I'll share more about that throughout the presentation. This area of research has formed the basis of publications that were shared with you. I focus in special education journals, but I also have a real focus on, to use an expression, I don't want to push an already open door. I like to share my ideas with a diverse and wide audience. So people who have not considered these ideas might consider them for the first time. And that's why I'm so grateful to be with all of you today and introduce some of these topics. I've also published with that focus in mind in education journals, and specifically qualitative methodology journals has been a real focus. I present annually on these topics. Internationally, I have most recently presented to the Human Capability Association, and annually I present at the American Educational Research Association. And I'll add that I also review annually the papers that get submitted to that conference. I serve, as was mentioned, on an editorial board, as well as doing ad hoc reviews for other journals that focus on special education, education, and methodologies. And it's within all of those different experiences that I have, they form the basis of what I'd like to share with you today. So I have essentially one top tip when I think about publication in high impact journals, and I'd like to really focus on that one top tip with you today. And it's this idea that is in bold yellow, original research. Now, on the one hand, that's a very straightforward definition. We see the call for original research in the aim and the scope of almost every journal. They ask for original research. And it's quite straightforward. What they mean is research that has not been published in print before. So you may have talked about this research with a colleague, you may have applied for a grant, you may have presented it at a conference verbally, but original research means you have not published in a book or in any other journal what this research findings are. What I'd like us to focus on today is expanding that definition of original research to consider the ways in which original research may also be innovative and inclusive. So when we talk about innovation, maybe we can find ways to bring in a clear research paradigm and an exciting new, innovative, novel theoretical framework, and use that as a thread throughout our research. Likewise, if we're aiming to be more inclusive in our research, maybe we can find ways to add a diverse sample of participation and invite a wide array of diverse participants to take part in the research we're doing. If we can achieve those things, I'd argue we'd enhance the originality of our research and therefore become more likely to get published in high impact journals. In terms of the presentation today, these are sort of the two branches that I'll be talking about. One is more theoretical, and after that discussion on research paradigms and theoretical frameworks, I'll pause and address any questions you might have. And then I'll start back again on sort of the how-to and inclusion and inviting diverse participation within our research. In order to talk about these different concepts, we're going to go through a number of key terms. Some of them may be quite new to you. First off, we're just going to be defining what is disability. And that was something that I promised and sort of embrace the complexity and intersectionality of diversity. Likewise, we're going to discuss and define inclusive research, as well as associated theoretical frameworks, and I'll give some examples from my own work. Then, after a pause for your questions, we'll get into the concepts of inviting participation, and in particular, look at a concept called vulnerability, and then define assent, and how that is a key point when we're thinking about our procedures for informed consent. And I'll end with a few examples from my own practice to help you consider design of your own research, as well as review of research, whether you're considering accepting this research in high impact journals or accepting it as part of the institutional review procedures. Okay, so with that in mind, we're going to jump in to the theoretical aspects of my presentation. And as promised, what is disability? I've presented on disability a lot as it was introduced. And what I know is when I say that I research with individuals with significant disabilities, likewise, many of you are thinking of, you have an image in your mind, or you have a clear understanding of what I mean by significant disability. But what I also know is I imagine almost all of you have a different understanding of what I mean by significant disability. And in part, that's due to the diversity of disability, right? Folks are impacted intellectually, behaviorally, with their senses, with their health. And that's just to name a few. This gets further complicated and made further complex with the intersectionality of disability and all these terms that you see on the side of underneath that flag there, when we talk about how disability is one experience, but it also becomes a complex mix when we're taking into account one's race, culture, socioeconomic status, geographical location. And we so often ask that our research includes diversity, but we also so often, as was rightly introduced, we leave off the disability experience. And so what we'll be thinking about, in the one hand, when I am inviting you to think about what comes to mind with significant disability, I could, if I wanted to, try to relieve your confusions by saying a very clear and pinpointed definition. Something like, when I talk about significant disability, I think about those who are severely, profoundly impacted by their disabilities, individuals who are in the highest 1% of most significantly impacted through multiple disabilities. I could give you an example, like a young man will be talking about later in the presentation. He had profound autism and coupled with an intellectual disability, which meant that he didn't communicate verbally. Likewise, he had a vision impairment, so could not see, and behaviors that were inconsistent. Now, the problem with this definition, though, is it's very much focused on what the young man couldn't do. And likewise, it positions his disability as entirely within himself and only impacting him. Within my own research, I like to focus more on a socially oriented definition of disability. And I like to describe that through a metaphor. If you think of an individual who uses a wheelchair for mobility, that person likely has their whole home and their surroundings well adapted so that they don't even feel disabled or don't feel their impairment on a day-to-day basis. They can probably map their routes within the community, find access to public transportation, and they've got all that figured out for their day-to-day life. And it's only when they come to a new building and there's no ramp to get past the stairs that they suddenly feel the impact of their impairment. Now, a social orientation says that we need to address the lack of ramps. We need to look at our community spaces and make sure that they're universally designed. However, when you replace the wheelchair using individual with my emphasis on individuals with more significant disabilities, and likewise, you replace the ramp with the complexities of leaving school and embarking on your young adult life in the community, the picture gets far more complex. My commitment is to understand that complexity from the perspectives of young adults who are living through it. It's this idea of being included in the research. So that's a nice segue to an inclusive research paradigm. What I mean by this most broadly is research that is with rather than research that is on, as historically has been the case. We research on disability rather than inviting that participation. But there are commitments even further than that with an inclusive research paradigm. We're not only being inclusive in the invitation, we're also really considering the ways in which our findings directly impact those that we invite to research. And I'm sharing this with you with my lens on disability, but I'll add that inclusive research is not particular to only disability. You may have heard of inclusive research paradigms such as participatory research, emancipatory research, action research. These all have a lot of similarities and unique differences, but they all share that inclusive spirit of invitation and participation. This paradigm couples nicely with a theoretical framework that I've often used in my research on the capability approach. And I say this as a novel theoretical framework because the capability approach was actually conceived of by Amartya Sen from India, who developed it as an economic framework of human development. And it was only years later, a philosopher in the States by the name of Martha Nussbaum came along and directly applied the theory of the capability approach to the disability experience through a focus on dignity. Now, dignity can impact all number of aspects of life, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But essentially, this capability framework enabled me to focus on, again, not what people can't do, but rather what they can. And likewise, it was the belief that the invitation to participate in research is not only so that I can get published in high impact journals, but because I truly care about the well-being and the capability and the opportunities of these young adults, and I want to make conditions better for them. So let me just share with you now a few examples of how the capability approach impacted all aspects of my research. Starting right from the start, the research questions I was asking. I was interested in not any transition. I was interested in a transition with dignity. Now, my area of study is one that we know quite a lot about. There are longitudinal work that follows and tracks nationally representative samples of individuals and their transitions. We have a lot of intervention studies looking at the implications of certain policies. But within that data corpus, we also learn so much about what goes wrong with transition. Not enough employment, not enough post-secondary opportunities, not enough community integration and opportunities to live outside of the home in inclusive ways. And again, that's important to know, but I also want to know about the possibilities. And I want to know what those possibilities are, again, from the perspective of those who we haven't often heard. What we do to address some of the problems of transition is to put a lot of supports into place. And so individuals, especially with significant disabilities, are very fortunate to be supported by their parents, their teachers, their community support workers, social services and social welfare agencies. The problem is that so often within this complex web of support, the perspective we don't get to hear as often is the student themselves in transition. So you can see that my interest in the research questions enables the individual to impact their own transition and have more of a voice, to use a sort of ableist framing. They have more of a voice within their own transitions, as well as enabling them to have more of a contribution to research on the topic. That folds nicely into this idea of capability and agency. I didn't want to hold so firmly on my research protocols that I could not invite participation from a diverse pool of potential participants. I wanted to adapt my methodologies and my qualitative data collection techniques so that I can embrace individual communication preferences. So you'll see a few examples of this in a little bit. But if you're interested, I included this 2021 article that was internationally published. This one is focusing on interview techniques. And you think of a qualitative interview as very structured with key questions that you ask of everyone. This article explores, methodologically speaking, over 7 different ways in which I adapted interview protocols to be more inclusive. Capability also impacted my analytical framework. Going back to Martha Nussbaum, she articulated 10 central human capabilities that she felt were necessary in order to ensure dignity. I use those 10 human capabilities as a deductive framework to analyze the experiences of cases of transition that I was following. And it was a helpful way to use the capability to structure that analysis. And then within the findings, when I found instances of indignity, where it's not to ignore the problems of transition, but capability and using capability as an analytical framework helped me to find ways to address those concerns. So the 2019 article that I share with you there is talking about the struggles of collaboration when young adults are trying to trial or test for suitability what options are available following school. And again, this journal article came out in Canada, but helping folks to explore not the problems, but the possibilities that are there when we look at these experiences from the perspective of young adults. So I've done a lot of talking. I'm going to stop sharing for just a second, and we have a moderator who can check in and see if there are any questions.
All right, I'm here.
Thank you.
I'm listening to you, really. I'm taking notes also. Research with and research on. So beautifully phrased. And transition with dignity. Capability as agency. Really, really very helpful. I will certainly make use of those phrases. No question in the meantime, please. You can go ahead.
Okay, I know the chat feature isn't on, so if anyone wants to, they can raise their hand. This is sort of, I'm wrapping up the theoretical side of my presentation on the why. So terms that you have offered are really important in terms of social justice, agency, dignity. Those are the sort of why and the theoretical side. Now we're going to move on a bit more to the how. So I'm giving just one more teacher pause if there is anyone who wants to raise their hand while I get up my second half of the presentation.
Excuse me, Sarah.
Yeah.
Dear admins, please, can you make the chat box available for the participants here? I understand that chat isn't available at this time.
Yeah. I think
Better.
folks can still raise their hands or even unmute if they have any questions.
Yeah.
But hearing none at the moment. So we'll keep going on the how-to, and then maybe there'll be some additional questions at that point. Okay, so like I said, we've focused on the theoretical, the paradigms and the theoretical frameworks that can be new, novel, and exciting, that can also enhance the publication in high impact journals. Now, this second half of the presentation is focused on how to invite participation in research. And I'll begin by saying, this is why I put in my introduction that I serve on the Institutional Review Board at my university, but I have been involved in human research ethics internationally back when I was working in New Zealand as well. And what I can assure you is that all human beings have securities and safeguards in terms of having their research with human beings reviewed before it takes place, whether it's quantitative, qualitative, or otherwise. My interest here is in particular on a group of people who are considered vulnerable. And so you'll see the list shared here. That's babies and children, incarcerated individuals, meaning those who are imprisoned or institutionalized, individuals who are pregnant, including their fetus, and then, of course, pertinent to our topic, those with disabilities. I want to just point out for a moment, when we talk about disability, let's go back to that diversity of disability, right? What we notice here, maybe it jumped out to you, or maybe I'll point it out, disability is likely the only category of vulnerability that a person could have for their entire life. For example, if you take someone who is pregnant, that's 9 months of being classified as vulnerable, and then you're no longer in that vulnerable group. Likewise, children at age 18, they age out of that vulnerability. But some with disabilities that were born with those disabilities are going to have that vulnerability considered associated with them for their entire life. But again, that diversity of disability, think about, for example, someone with a vision impairment, that individual would not be considered vulnerable if you were asking for a focus group interview, for example. But they may be considered vulnerable if part of your research design is an observation in a busy city that they've never been to before. So a theme of this second half of the presentation is really needing to address the process of an invitation to research on a case-by-case basis. So as I've mentioned already, research of any human being needs to be reviewed by either a human research ethics committee, or we use in the States an institutional review board. But when we talk about those with vulnerabilities, that requires more scrutiny from a full committee review to ensure that the research methods do not cause more than minimal harm. And this is a bit of a vague topic, but essentially what they're meaning is that it's not going to be more than you would likely encounter in your day-to-day life. Now, what I'd argue, and my concerns when we think about vulnerability, is essentially vulnerability is connected to one's human rights. And on the one hand, what we're trying to do as a research ethics committee is to ensure that human right of safety. But sometimes the unintended consequences of that full committee review, of that heavy level of scrutiny, make certain researchers uninterested, and they don't think that they want that participation in their research. And then what we need to make sure we're safeguarding is that we're protecting the human right to be heard, that everyone needs to be able to contribute. And what we have found from the World Health Organizations and other international bodies is we just don't know so much about the disability experience. We need to learn so much more, whether it's in my area of focus in education or other experiences. And again, this connects nicely to that sort of social orientation of disability. If we go back again to that wheelchair using individual and the ramp that they can't get past, sometimes those ramps that we can't get past are not physical ones. They're our own attitudes, our beliefs, and our stereotypes that the disability experience is very one-sided or very childlike and doesn't offer enough rigor to our research. We really need to change our lens in that sense so that vulnerability is something we need to address, but something that we don't pander to. I'll give some more description. So the informed consent procedure is the process of informing and the product of consent. And this needs to be done, again, for any human being that we invite into our research. And I'll describe the basic elements of what is involved. The informing part and the process that I think of involved in informing is about explaining the research. So elements such as, what's the purpose of your research and how long will it last? What's the duration? How much involvement does the participant need? Can you describe exactly what the participant will be doing in terms of your procedures, including any risks, discomforts, or benefits? And those benefits may be to the individual, or it might be to your whole field of study and your area of knowledge. What are the alternatives to participation, including partial or non-participation? And how will confidentiality maintained? How will it be anonymous that this person chose to take part? What are the contact details for someone if there are questions or if concerns come up? And how will they know that it's a voluntary study? They can stop at any time without any loss or penalty. And that's really important when you think of, for example, researchers that do research within their own class. Students need to know that they can stop researching and they're not going to get a bad grade, or they're not going to miss out on valuable content. So with the informed process underway, the product is quite literally a legal agreement. The person signs along the line saying that they record their willingness to participate. Now, this is the legal procedure of informed consent, but when a person is considered part of a vulnerable group, sometimes they are offered assent. And in many ways, the features of assent should share all of these elements, not because they're legally required, but because we believe in those inclusive research paradigms and those capabilities. And so if we want to be inclusive and participatory in our research, we have to do everything that we can to ensure that the potential participant understands what they're embarking on. But again, this is a very case-by-case basis. And it makes assent, again, less of a legal feature and more of a moral obligation. This is the right thing to do when we want to develop inclusive participatory research. So I'm just going to go through a few examples of how this all panned out for me in various case examples in my research. And I'm going to start actually with the image on the right-hand side. I call this an adapted assent form. Now, going back to informed consent for a minute, you could imagine with all the basic elements that I described there, so many, these documents of consent forms are long. They're multiple pages with a lot of text. We try to make sure that all key terms are explained, but they get very technical because it's a legal contract, it's an agreement. An adapted assent form, like the one you see on the right-hand side, one of the key features is that it's in plain language. Short sentences, simple language that's very clear. And where possible, what you see is images, like a photo of myself, since I would be the researcher in that example, that help clarify the meaning of what I'm trying to convey. Likewise, it's in a sequential order with clear boundaries to just, again, enhance the structure and clarify as simply as possible what will be involved in research. This example on the right-hand side, the assent form, could be read through or read aloud and then signed, much like an informed consent form. But then we start making some real accommodations and adaptations. And so you see the middle image there is of a messenger bag. And this is an example to me of what I call process assent. I'm returning now to the young man that I introduced you at the start of my presentation. Reminder, he is a young man with profound autism and intellectual disabilities. He did not communicate verbally, also had a vision impairment and very inconsistent behaviors. So process assent for this young man was a two-part. First, a sensory signature. Now, this example comes from New Zealand, where my American accent stood out from the young man's teaching team that was based in New Zealand. And so I would indicate to him every time I was present for field research by calling out my name and welcoming him in my American accent. A sensory signature could be anything. It could be a noise, a sound, a smell, anything to indicate your presence. But then there's that invitation to participate. And so in this instance, I would carry my fieldwork materials in the messenger bag, my notebooks, recorders, pens, things like that. And I invited him to come and touch and review what materials I brought with me that day. And it was in the touching of those objects that we considered this to be a process of him assenting for the research that day. Now, the final example is on the left-hand side of the slide. That cartoon image is one that I use to describe a hui. I'm still in New Zealand in this example. This young man was of indigenous Maori origin, and he was more accustomed to collective decision-making. So with that in mind, his mother called a hui, or a gathering, of his whānau family and extended family. And bringing together all of these individuals, we could talk about the research, much like was provided in the adapted assent form, but it was a collective decision-making. It was the discussions, the questions, and in those conversations, the young man was supported by his whānau family to offer his assent to participate. So these are only 3 examples, but I think I like to share them because they show what a wide array of differences and diversity of accommodations and adaptations that you can make to those invitations for participation. I just want to conclude on some considerations for implementation. And I share that again in terms of when you're thinking about designing your own research or when you're reviewing research, either for its human ethics and its institutional review, or when you're thinking about whether or not to publish a paper in a high impact journal. My first consideration is that assent is an ongoing process that needs to be monitored and taught. So let's return again to that young man with the messenger bag. I would go through that process, that multi-process assent, every time that I was doing field work. And I was with this young man for quite over a year. And every visit, every instance of field work, I was checking in exactly that same manner. Now, this is important because while I of course, want him to offer his assent, we also need to be prepared for dissent and not wanting to participate in research. And so no matter what the design of your study is, even if you're doing a survey that might ask for participation for an hour or a half hour, what ways are you going to enable your potential participants to communicate when they want to stop, when they want to take a break, when they want to do this on another day? Importantly, we also need to consider ways in which we teach these procedures. So just because I spent all that time doing the adaptations that I just shared with you in the previous slide, it doesn't mean that potential participants understand what I've created for them. I need to teach it. And the ways in which we teach that may need to be practiced multiple times. That also segues quite nicely to my second point, relationships. We are often taught as researchers that we need detached objectivity, and that is very important. We do need an element of that, especially when we're thinking about the rigor of our studies that we're publishing in high-impact journals. But we also need people. And when you think about it quite technically, this vulnerability adds even more relationships to the mix. We need to ask for the legal informed consent from a parent or a caregiver. But we also need those folks to help make those adaptations and accommodations for assent. And so in every one of those examples that I shared with you, before that came meetings with the families asking to understand the communication preferences and understand how best to connect with the young adult. There's time and relationships that need to be formed. And these ideas form the basis of this British article that was published in 2020 that I'm sharing with you in that citation. But I think as a conclusion, it's very important to just remember that is in all aspects of life and in our research, nothing can replace lived experience. And so while we as researchers understand what's involved in research quite extensively from our experience, our potential participants may not have that level of experience. And with that in mind, we need to form those relationships so that we're treating them not as subjects in our study, but as human beings and of partners and participants of our research. So with that in mind, I want to say good luck on publishing your innovative and inclusive original research. Thank you so much for your time, and again, to be able to contribute to this important topic that you are all focused on. And I'm available for any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Sarah Hart. In the meantime, one Ms. Tilaga Jagaya has raised her hand. She has some question, I believe. Now, we can see her there on the screen. She wants to ask something to you. Please, Tilaga, then.
Hi, I could ask my questions later if someone else wants to ask, because I can always chat with Sarah very easily. So I would open it to the floor first before I ask Sarah. Yeah. Anyone else to ask?
Dear participants, it's your time to ask us some question, if you have.
Yes, TJ, Dr. Ganesan here.
Hi.
And Dr. Sarah, how are you?
Dr. Ganesan, welcome. Dr. Ganesan, welcome.
Yeah.
Could you please introduce yourself? You're from Malaysia.
Yes, I'm from Malaysia.
Right.
Of course, now it's around 10, going to be 10:30 p.m.
Thank you for sticking with me into the evening. This is a lot of content for
Yeah. And thank you very much, Sarah, for taking part in this workshop. I'm very glad that you're here. And it's a very good topic for of yours one. So I just want to know, just now you were talking about to ensure the research method do not cause more than minimal harm. There was one slide there, right? Minimal harm. So can you please, explain to us again on that, actually?
Yeah, that's a really great question. This is coming more from my lens as a member of our institutional review board. This is actually something that many researchers struggle with to demonstrate. because the minimal harm question can go impact a lot of different ways. An example is coming to my mind. Again, I'm a qualitative researcher, so I have a qualitative example. I look at interview questions, for example. And if you're asking about things like I might ask in my research about what is it feeling like to graduate from school, that's probably a minimal harm question. It might be a little upsetting because you're leaving school and that would be sad, but that's an experience you're going to have in your day-to-day life. Now, if I'm reviewing a proposal of research and the questions are about abuse, they're about traumas, traumas of very specific natures where you're asking the participant to talk through and share really personal experiences, that is greater than minimal risk. That is more than you would encounter in your day-to-day life, someone asking those things of you. And when that is in place, it's not to say that the research can't happen, but you need to ensure that your participant is informed very clearly that that's the nature of the questions that are going to be asked. And furthermore, safeguards need to be in place if your interview was very upsetting to them and they need extra counseling or extra coaching. Those resources need to be available. Typically, what we would ask for is a debriefing form so that you could review with them if that day or later that week or sometime it's triggered issues for the person. Who can they get in touch with? Who can they contact? And that's, again, your obligation as a researcher that's conducting ethical research, that you want to know their perspective. It's valuable, but you also want to support them as a human being.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much.
Yeah. My examples tend to be qualitative, but you could imagine,
yes,
especially as we look at medical research, there are also certainly considerations there as well. I don't as often review medical research, but when you think of clinical trials and things like that, it becomes very important. Education-wise, we have intervention studies, for example, where some students are participating in an exciting new intervention, but we need a control sample as well. So how are we securing the fact that even those who didn't get the intervention maybe will get that same intervention at a later point in time? These are all important considerations for the researchers to work out. And if those are not worked out, that's what our human research ethics boards are there to protect the potential participant, so that we ask the researcher to consider those.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the question. It's a great one.
I think Ms. Tilaga Jagaya, you can proceed now. Could you please introduce yourself and continue?
Okay, yeah. My name is Tilaga Jagaya, also known as TJ. I am a colleague of Sarah's. We work at the same university. And Sarah, that's
nice
Ganesan, that's the person.
And you were my ex-colleague?
Yeah, I'm also Ganesan's ex-colleague, and he's the one who has been, interacting with me and trying to share the information with you.
Oh, it's so great to put names and faces together. Lovely to meet you.
Quite interesting to see you all together now.
Yeah.
You should see us in the hallway on campus, even with our masks on.
Sure.
Sarah and I are just neighboring office. So my question is, Sarah, I'm not sure, this could be my thought, my concerns or my question. So I saw that when you say assent, you need to actually explain the purpose to the participants. So let's say when I start off, I'm not sure if this is ethical, I start off by saying, this is my purpose of my study. And then once I've collected data, using that purpose, and then probably I still continue using the data for a different purpose, do I need to inform the participant? Because you're part of the internal review board at the university. So I'm wondering, is it ethical or unethical if I don't tell the participant?
So yes, this is important. And this is when I think of like secondary analysis, and there's protocols in America, and they may vary somewhat slightly internationally, but in America, the standard is that you would keep your data set for about 5 years. And after that point in time, you need to destroy your materials or reapply for the process on how you're going to be managing that data into the future. I think this is an important distinction between consent and assent. And while we do the best we can to inform the assent procedures, it may be very challenging for someone with more significant disabilities to even understand concepts of time that extend beyond 5 years. And so what we need to absolutely ensure is that the legal informed consent that came from a caregiver or someone who is, I should stop at say also that it's quite often the case that an individual with more significant disabilities is not their own guardian. And for that, then they need a guardian to offer that informed legal consent. And so very much so, yes, this information would need to be provided on who's going to be seeing the data, in what form. Have you done what needs to be done to create pseudonyms or codes so that it's not the person's identifying details that are being shared? But then, of course, assent procedures, if you think on a case-by-case basis that someone could understand the longitudinal nature and impacts of your research, then absolutely you would want to inform them. But it would just really depend on that case whether or not assent could be adapted in that way.
Just to add to what you said, Sarah, I did submit my manuscript for publishing in a high-tiered journal, and they were asking, what did you tell? Can you give a description? What information you gave your participants?
That's great. I'm glad that you're echoing that, because maybe it's also the nature of journals that I'm publishing in and the topics that I'm publishing in, but it is a question that if you're not clear on, it will get asked by your reviewers. And they don't want to just know, yes, you have received institutional review. They want to know that assent procedure. How have you really informed your participants who are vulnerable?
So,
Is that all? Okay, anybody from the participant side? Dr. Sarah, who has done a lot of research among the young or adolescent persons who are suffering from a few disabilities. She was beautifully explaining us disability could be in any form based on race, culture, socio-economical background. Even sometimes it could be a geological problem or portion.
Absolutely. I think it's important that's that understanding of intersectionality. When I think about the capability approach to disability, what I like is that we're focusing not on the negatives, but on what positive contributions disability can offer. But then that intersectional mix is your cultural backgrounds, your geographic backgrounds, your socioeconomic ones. They all add to the picture and that complexity. And that's part of what journals are wanting these days. They want to make sure that your population is informed, yes, but also diverse. And so that's why I think it is very important, beyond also, of course, the ethics that I believe in terms of that socially just perspective of being heard and being able to contribute.
Thank you, Dr. Sarah. I think since no one is ready to ask you any question, I think I can say big thanks to you. Before that, I would like to quote a few phrases from your slide. Based on your presentation, I understand that the purpose of research and the expected duration must be well defined. And the second one is your description of procedures is very much needed. Third one is the confidentiality must be maintained till the end. Really, really, really very much interesting. And the final one, when I introduced you, I said that you have done some research based on the practicalities of life, and you have concentrated more on the life principles. When we think about the disability or the persons who are suffering from disability, as you said, racial, cultural, all other problems are there. So I got from your presentation, our research must be relationship based. It is really, really an appealing one. So thank you very much for throwing light on such unexposed areas. Sometimes research is started and it goes on in its own direction, and we have to pull it back into the main groove, right? We have a lot of problems in such things with when we start and do without planning. But your research has given, your presentation has given, I'm sure that all the participants here would duly agree that your presentation has given us a broader idea how to start, how to continue, and how to stop. Thank you very much. And one thing you have mentioned before when you were answering Mrs. Tilaga Jakaya, in America, for every 5 years, the data has to be revised. So that is how we update, and that's how we sail on in the front line. Thank you very much for being with us this evening. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ganesan.
Yes,
Thanks
yes.
a lot for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Jagaya, and all the other participants here. Thank you so much. Dr. Rajesh, it's your time.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for moderating us, and I thank Dr. Sarah. Thank you, ma'am, for your wonderful presentation and for all the cooperation of all the people here, especially the participants, Ganeshan, sir,
Yeah.
and all people here. Moreover, I would like to thank Lavender Literary Club, Capcomarin, and Malaysian Relation Department for organizing such a day for us amidst us, and they have brought us light in, because most of the people are not aware of what research is and how to carry on research. But actually, learning is an ocean, and what we have come through is just a pebble in it. I thank Lavender Club, and also I wish you all to enlighten yourself and burn as a fire. Thank you. Thank you for the day. And thank you for the
Dr.
speakers.
Rajesh. God
Thank
bless
you.
you all.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.